My mom's boyfriend tried to take my autistic twin brother away by filing false abuse reports. Then he had him institutionalized while ignoring his medical crisis, so I exposed his lies and fought to save our family. I've been my autistic twin brother's caregiver since we were 12, and now my mom's boyfriend is trying to get him institutionalized. Casey is nonverbal and needs constant supervision, but he communicates with me in ways nobody else understands. When he flaps his hands twice, then points left, he needs the bathroom. When he rocks and hums that specific tune, he's overstimulated and needs his weighted blanket. I learned all this through 8 years of sleeping 3 hours a night and missing every normal teenage experience you can imagine. My mom works double shifts as a nurse, so I handle everything from medication schedules to violent meltdowns that last hours. Then Tom showed up 3 months ago, calling himself a disability advocate who wanted to help our family. He seemed perfect at first, bringing research about autism services and offering to navigate the bureaucracy we'd been struggling with for years. Mom was exhausted and isolated, so when this charming professional took interest in her and promised to solve our problems, she fell hard and fast. But I started noticing things that didn't add up. Tom claimed autism expertise, but suggested interventions that made Casey more agitated. He wanted to film our daily routines for better services, but asked me to demonstrate challenging situations when I was already exhausted. Casey's meltdowns increased whenever Tom visited, and he started showing regression behaviors like losing communication skills he'd worked years to develop. When I mentioned Casey's distress, Tom blamed my inconsistent methods and convinced Mom I was too emotionally invested. He moved in after 6 weeks and immediately began changing Casey's routines, which triggered even worse episodes. I found myself excluded from meetings about Casey's future planning, while Tom positioned himself as the objective professional voice for our family. The breaking point came when I discovered a hidden camera in Casey's room during one of his 4-hour meltdowns. Tom claimed it was for Casey's protection, but I realized he'd been filming me. He showed Mom edited clips that made my desperate attempts to keep Casey safe look abusive without any context. Mom started questioning whether I was too young for this responsibility, which I argued this was the oldest I had been caring for him. Meanwhile, Tom presented residential care as the solution to all our problems. He'd already researched facilities and explained how Casey's disability benefits could support us. The facility he recommended was cheap and far from family, but Tom assured us it was the best option for Casey's growth and development. What I didn't realize was that Tom had already filed a CPS report using his professional credentials, claiming I was neglecting and potentially abusing Casey. He'd built his case over weeks, using footage from Casey's room. The investigation moved quickly, and within days they were talking about removing Casey for evaluation while determining the best long-term placement. I tried explaining Casey's communication methods and how he'd deteriorate without consistent caregiving, but the system deferred to Tom's professional assessment over my intimate knowledge. Casey became completely dysregulated during the CPS visit, unable to communicate with strangers, and showing all his worst behaviors while separated from me. Tom used this as further evidence that I couldn't properly manage Casey's needs and that professional intervention was urgently required. They removed Casey on a Friday afternoon, and by Monday morning he was in medical crisis. Mom got the call at work that Casey had stopped eating, became completely nonverbal, and started severe self-injurious behavior that required immediate medical intervention. Mom found Casey restrained and his face bruised from hitting his head against the hospital bed rails. The medical team was struggling to calm him, and Tom arrived shortly after Mom, but instead of comforting Casey or helping the staff understand his needs, he immediately started discussing insurance coverage and whether the recommended facility could handle medical complications. Mom watched her boyfriend show complete indifference to her son's suffering while focusing on financial logistics, and she asked him to give our family some space. Tom just smiled and walked away. It was a start, but not even close to a happy ending for us. I rushed to the hospital while Mom stayed with Casey, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The emergency room doors slid open to reveal chaos, but I spotted Tom immediately. He stood at the nurse's station with perfect posture, efficiently filling out paperwork while occasionally glancing at his phone. When he noticed me approaching, his thumb quickly swiped to minimize whatever he'd been reading. Mom intercepted me before I could reach him, her face a mixture of exhaustion and confusion. She grabbed my arm and pulled me aside, her words tumbling out in a desperate whisper. She explained how Tom had known exactly which forms Casey needed, even details about his medication allergies that she'd never mentioned. Her voice cracked when she admitted Tom had told her he'd been watching our family's struggle for months before approaching us, wanting to help at just the right time. The hospital social worker appeared with a clipboard, barely acknowledging me before turning to Tom with obvious deference. She addressed him by his professional title, asking about Casey's care plan. I caught a glimpse of his identification badge as he shifted positions, noticing the expiration date was only 2 days away. Tom's hand moved smoothly to his pocket, sliding the badge out of view when he caught me looking. Tom guided Mom toward a quiet corner with more paperwork, his voice taking on that practiced therapeutic tone I'd grown to hate. He mentioned how difficult this must be for her, especially with the financial burden. Then he dropped his bomb, casually mentioning he could help with those collection notices from her late husband's medical bills that she thought nobody knew about. Mom's face went white, and she signed whatever he put in front of her without reading it. I made my choice then, turning away from their conversation to find Casey. He needed me more than I needed to confront Tom's manipulation. But as I walked toward the treatment rooms, I passed an alcove where Tom's voice carried clearly. He was on his phone, scheduling what he called family consultations with 2 other mothers for later that week, using the same soothing tone he'd used with Mom. Casey lay on the hospital bed, his wrists padded but still restrained, his face turned away from the harsh lights. I sat beside him and began our routine, humming the lullaby that sometimes calmed him. While I stroked his hair, Tom's voice drifted from the hallway where he spoke with nursing staff. He was describing concerning behavior patterns he'd observed in me, using clinical terms to paint a picture of an overwhelmed caregiver who might pose risks. He suggested specific red flags the staff should document. The timing of Casey's crisis couldn't have been more convenient for Tom. As I reviewed the paperwork later, I realized his forms covered standard emergency scenarios that could apply to any disabled family member. He'd come prepared for exactly this situation, with documents ready to establish his his authority over Casey's care decisions. I stepped away briefly to call Mom's workplace, hoping her supervisor might help us navigate this crisis. But the receptionist informed me that Tom had already called, introducing himself as our family advocate who was managing the situation. He'd assured them Mom would need time off and that he was handling all the necessary arrangements. Tom appeared in Casey's room suddenly, his face contorting into an expression of distress. His breathing became labored, hands clutching his chest as he stumbled against the wall. The nurses rushed to help him, but I noticed him check his watch during his apparent breakdown, timing something. When they suggested he sit down, he insisted he needed to stay strong for our family, playing the devoted partner perfectly. Casey's eyes had been tracking the commotion, and when Tom spoke, something shifted in his expression. His fingers moved in a pattern I'd never seen before, but there was recognition in his gaze when he looked at Tom. My brother had been listening and learning about this man far longer than any of us had realized, storing information in his own way. While the medical team fussed over Tom, I spotted his leather notebook on the chair where he'd been sitting. The pages visible showed detailed notes about our family dynamics, stress points mapped out like a battle plan. Each family member had a column listing vulnerabilities and pressure points. Taking it would mean leaving Casey's side during his medical emergency, and Tom would notice immediately. Security arrived without warning, 2 guards who politely but firmly informed me that I needed to leave. Tom had apparently filed paperwork earlier, citing his emergency authorization as Casey's advocate. As they escorted me toward the exit, I looked back to see Casey's eyes following my movement with unusual focus and awareness, his fingers moving in that new pattern again. Tom already had Casey's discharge planning mapped out before the doctors even stabilized him. He revealed he'd been appointed case coordinator for 3 other disabled adults in our community, giving him established credibility with the hospital administration. The system trusted his expertise over my 8 years of lived experience. Mom's defensive responses when I tried to talk to her later followed a script I'd heard before. Her words about trusting the professionals and not being too emotional matched exactly what Mrs. Rodriguez had said when her son was removed, and what Mrs. Kim had repeated when her daughter was institutionalized. The phrasing was identical, as if Tom had given them all the same talking points. I discovered Tom had been screenshotting my text messages for weeks, but he wasn't just collecting them. He was manufacturing context by scheduling incidents that made my normal family advocacy appear obsessive. A worried message about Casey's medication became evidence of controlling behavior when Tom arranged for the pharmacy to be out of stock, forcing multiple anxious calls from me. The stalking allegations that appeared in official documents came from Tom's proactive complaints to police. He'd filed them using his professional credentials, describing himself as a concerned advocate trying to help a family in crisis while dealing with an unstable family member who was fixated on him. Tom's control extended far beyond managing Casey's benefits. Through careful observation, I realized he was systematically isolating families from their support networks. He'd provide professional referrals that seemed helpful, but led to his allies, creating closed loops where his version of events was the only one heard. My confrontation at the pharmacy had been a setup. After I left, Tom had immediately called them, positioning himself as the concerned family advocate managing a difficult situation. He'd apologized for my behavior and assured them he was handling things, making me look unstable while he appeared reasonable and professional. Mom's sister stopped returning my calls after Tom revealed details about my past struggles that Mom had shared with him in confidence. He'd twisted the information to make it seem like Mom was deeply concerned about my stability, suggesting the family needed professional intervention for everyone's safety. Our neighbors began avoiding me after Tom distributed what he called safety concerns about our family crisis. He'd positioned himself as a professional resource in our community, someone they could turn to with questions about the situation. The local Facebook group showed a coordinated pattern of helpful advice that all traced back to Tom's influence. During one conversation, Tom let slip what seemed like an accidental truth about his timeline. He mentioned something that happened before he claimed to have met us, then quickly corrected himself. But I realized it was strategic. He wanted me to catch that discrepancy and verify his corrected version, establishing credibility for bigger lies he was planning. My best friend suddenly needed Tom's reference for a job opportunity in autism services. Tom had systematically positioned himself as the gatekeeper for autism-related opportunities in our community, making it impossible for anyone to work in the field without his approval. When I tried to prove Tom's credentials were fake, I discovered something worse. He had multiple valid certifications under different specialties, all technically legitimate. I'd been attacking the wrong credentials while he built an unassailable professional reputation. Tom recorded my brief moment of victory when I thought I'd caught him in a lie. Later, I saw the edited version he'd prepared, showing me celebrating during our family crisis. The context was completely removed, making me appear callous about Casey's suffering while Tom worked tirelessly to help. Everything crystallized when Tom finally revealed his endgame. He pulled me aside one evening, his mask dropping for just a moment. He'd been testing my investigative skills and resilience, he said. He believed I could be valuable in his network with proper guidance. He saw potential in me to help other families the way he was helping ours. Tom's offer hung in the air between us as I processed his words. He waited patiently, studying my reaction with those calculating eyes. I turned away without responding and walked back into the hospital, my mind racing with the implications of what he'd just revealed. The next morning brought new complications. Tom had arranged for Casey's transfer to a specialized facility 2 hours away, presenting it as the best option for his recovery. Mom signed the papers while I watched helplessly from across the waiting room. Tom's influence over the medical staff was complete. They deferred to his recommendations without question. I followed the ambulance in my car, determined to stay close to Casey despite Tom's attempts to separate us. At the new facility, Tom had already established himself as the primary contact. The staff directed all questions to him while treating me as a problematic visitor who needed monitoring. Casey's condition deteriorated in the unfamiliar environment. He refused food, wouldn't make eye contact with anyone, and his self-injurious behaviors escalated. The facility's response was increased sedation and more restraints. When I tried explaining Casey's communication methods to the staff, Tom interrupted with his own interpretation, contradicting everything I said. During visiting hours, I noticed Casey watching Tom with with intense focus whenever he entered the room. His fingers moved in that new pattern repeatedly, as if he was trying to tell me something urgent. Tom noticed too, and started limiting my visits, citing Casey's agitation when I was present. I began documenting everything, taking photos of Casey's injuries and recording dates and times of incidents. Tom must have anticipated this because facility security confiscated my phone during my next visit, claiming new privacy policies. They returned it later with several photos mysteriously deleted. Tom's network revealed itself gradually. The facility director mentioned Tom's other success stories, families he'd helped navigate similar crises. She showed me testimonials from grateful parents, all following the same format, all praising Tom's professional guidance. The language was eerily similar to Mom's recent defensive responses. One afternoon, I arrived to find Tom in Casey's room with another family, a mother and her autistic daughter. He was explaining how my family's situation demonstrated the importance of professional intervention. The mother nodded along, signing papers while her daughter rocked in the corner, clearly distressed. I tried warning the mother, but Tom had poisoned that well already. She looked at me with pity, seeing exactly what Tom wanted her to see, an unstable young woman who couldn't accept help. Tom's satisfied expression as I was escorted out told me this was all part of his plan. Back home, I found our house subtly changed. Items had been moved, Casey's things reorganized. Tom had been systematically erasing Casey's presence, boxing up his belongings for safekeeping. Mom defended it as practical, but I saw it for what it was, Tom establishing territory. My investigation into Tom's background hit walls everywhere. His credentials checked out, his references were glowing, and his professional network was extensive. But I noticed patterns in the timing. His certifications all dated from the last 5 years, and his references all connected back to a small group of professionals who seemed to vouch for each other. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While researching Tom's previous cases, I found an old news article about a facility closure. Buried in the story was a mention of questionable referral practices and financial irregularities. Tom's name wasn't mentioned, but the timing aligned with his arrival in our state. I reached out to families Tom had helped before us. Most wouldn't talk, but Mrs. Rodriguez finally agreed to meet. She was skittish, constantly checking over her shoulder. Her son had been institutionalized 2 years ago on Tom's recommendation. She'd tried to fight it, but gave up when Tom's documentation proved overwhelming. Mrs. Rodriguez showed me papers she'd kept, Tom's reports about her son. The language was identical to what he'd written about Casey. The same phrases, the same progression of concerns, even the same recommendations. It was a template he'd perfected over multiple families. She revealed something crucial. Tom always targeted single mothers with disabled children, families already struggling with isolation and financial stress. He'd appear during a crisis, establish trust quickly, then systematically dismantle the family's support systems while positioning himself as their only advocate. Our meeting was cut short when Mrs. Rodriguez received a call. Her face went pale as she listened. Tom knew we'd met. He was already calling her caseworker, expressing concerns about her stability. She left quickly, begging me not to contact her again. I returned to the facility to find new restrictions in place. My visits were now supervised, limited to 30 minutes, and I couldn't be alone with Casey. Tom had filed reports citing my disruptive influence on Casey's treatment. The staff watched me like I was dangerous. During one supervised visit, Casey managed to communicate something new. While the aide was distracted, his fingers spelled out letters, not randomly, but deliberately. Tomhurt. He'd been teaching himself to fingerspell, adapting his communication despite his limitations. My brother had been building his own evidence. I tried documenting Casey's communication, but Tom was always one step ahead. He'd scheduled Casey for evaluations during my visits, arranged emergencies that cut our time short, or had staff interrupt whenever Casey tried to communicate. It was a careful dance of interference that looked like coincidence. The financial aspects of Tom's scheme became clearer when I reviewed our family's documents. Casey's disability benefits had been redirected to the facility, but the amounts didn't match. Tom had power of attorney now. Mom had signed it during the hospital crisis. Money was disappearing into administrative fees and specialized services that Casey wasn't receiving. I discovered Tom's employee assistance program at his workplace was his hunting ground. He had access to employee records, knew which families had disabled dependents, could identify those struggling with medical debt or single-parent stress. His position gave him credibility and inside information about vulnerable families. My attempts to record Tom's activities failed repeatedly. Phones would malfunction at crucial moments, recordings would be corrupted, or Tom would somehow know to change his behavior when I was documenting. He'd trained himself to maintain his facade perfectly, never slipping when potential evidence was being gathered. Casey's former teacher, Mrs. Chen, reached out unexpectedly. She'd been concerned about Casey's sudden removal from school, and Tom's explanations hadn't satisfied her. But when she'd questioned the situation, she'd received notice that her teaching position was under review. Tom's network included people in the school administration. Mrs. Chen revealed that Tom had approached her months ago about joining his advocacy network. He'd offered her consulting fees to identify families who might benefit from his services. When she declined, small problems started appearing. Lost paperwork, missed communications, minor incidents that accumulated into a performance review. The pattern was clear. Tom recruited professionals into his network with legitimate opportunities, then used them to identify and access vulnerable families. Those who refused found their careers subtly sabotaged. It was a self-protecting system that eliminated potential whistleblowers. I tried reaching out to disability advocacy groups, but Tom's reputation preceded me. He'd already contacted them, expressing concern about a family member who was struggling to accept professional help. They saw me as someone in denial, unable to recognize what was best for Casey. Tom had poisoned every well I might drink from. The facility began medicating Casey more heavily. They claimed it was for his safety, but I watched my brother become a shadow of himself. The boy who'd fought to communicate, who'd created his own language, was being chemically restrained into compliance. Tom called it therapeutic progress. During one visit, I found Casey's fingers moving constantly, even through the medication fog. He was practicing, maintaining his new skill despite everything. When Tom entered the room, Casey's movements became more agitated. He was documenting in the only way he could, through repetitive patterns that looked like stimming, but were actually records of of Tom's visits. I realized Casey had been studying Tom longer than any of us knew. Every interaction, every word, every pattern of behavior. Casey had been cataloging it all. His regression wasn't just from stress, it was partially strategic. He'd learned to hide his capabilities from Tom while secretly building his case. Tom's mistake was underestimating Casey. He saw a nonverbal autistic man and assumed limited cognition. But Casey had spent 8 years learning to communicate with me, and he'd applied that same intense focus to understanding Tom. My brother was playing a longer game than any of us realized. The facility's financial records were public, buried in state databases. I spent nights researching, tracking patterns of admissions and funding. Tom's facilities all showed the same pattern: a spike in admissions after he joined the community, increased funding requests, and families who never regained custody despite therapeutic progress. I found 3 other families in active crisis, all with Tom's involvement. The Johnsons were about to lose custody of their daughter. The Parks were fighting institutionalization for their son. The Williams family had just met Tom at a support group. All single mothers, all with significant medical debt, all in that vulnerable space where Tom operated. Attempting to warn these families backfired spectacularly. Tom had already prepared them for my interference. I was the unstable family member who couldn't accept help, who was selfishly trying to prevent their children from getting necessary care. My warnings pushed them closer to Tom, not further away. Tom's psychological manipulation was masterful. He created crises that he could solve, manufactured problems that required his expertise, and gradually made families dependent on his guidance. By the time families realized what was happening, he'd already documented months of concerning behaviors that made his version of events unassailable. I started sleeping in my car outside the facility, watching patterns of staff changes and Tom's visits. He noticed, of course, and used it as evidence of my deteriorating mental state. Security was called multiple times, creating a paper trail of disturbing behavior that Tom could reference later. Casey's password-protected files on our home computer revealed the depth of his documentation. He'd been screenshotting Tom's emails to Mom, recording conversations through his AAC device, and creating detailed logs of Tom's behavior. Everything was organized by date, categorized by type of manipulation, cross-referenced with similar patterns. The files went back months before Tom officially entered our lives. Casey had noticed him at the grocery store, the library, the park. Tom had been studying our family, learning our routines, identifying the perfect moment to introduce himself. Casey had recognized the stalking behavior because he'd experienced it with our father before he left. Tom's network extended into state agencies. Caseworkers who questioned his recommendations found themselves reassigned. Supervisors who investigated complaints discovered their own positions under review. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was a carefully cultivated professional network that protected its own interests. I discovered Tom wore Casey's clothes not from grief, but as a form of psychological territory marking. He'd done it with other families too. Small appropriations of the disabled person's belongings, subtle erasures of their presence while maintaining the appearance of caring. It was a pattern Casey had documented with disturbing clarity. The restaurant confrontation I'd planned went exactly as Tom intended. He'd coached the staff to expect me, described my harassment of his family, and ensured they were ready to document any disturbance. When I arrived, they were already nervous, phones ready to record. Tom had orchestrated the entire scene. My job loss came through channels that seemed unconnected to Tom. Performance issues, missed deadlines, complaints from clients I'd never had problems with before. But investigating revealed Tom's network members in key positions, not controlling everything, but influencing enough to create a pattern of problems that justified termination. Finding housing became impossible. Landlords received anonymous tips about my instability. References disappeared or gave lukewarm recommendations. Tom's influence was subtle but pervasive, not blacklisting, but creating enough doubt to make me an undesirable tenant. I moved between friends' couches, each stay shorter than the last. Mom's breaking point came when Tom revealed he knew about Dad's addiction issues, not just that he'd left, but the gambling debts, the secret remortgages, the money Mom had hidden to protect us. Tom presented it as concern for our family's history of poor judgment, using Dad's failures to question Mom's ability to make decisions about Casey. The therapy clinic's suspension was interconnected with 5 other clinics that had questioned Tom's referral patterns. All faced similar issues: licensing reviews, insurance audits, minor violations that accumulated into major problems. The message was clear: cooperate with Tom's network or face professional destruction. Casey's former caseworker, Catherine, reached out secretly. She'd been investigating Tom's methods for months, collecting evidence from multiple families, but she needed more. Specifically, she needed Casey's documentation. The challenge was accessing it without alerting Tom to its existence. I learned to think like Tom, anticipating his moves and preparing counters. When he scheduled surprise facility visits during my time with Casey, I had backup plans. When he filed complaints about my behavior, I had documentation ready. It was exhausting, but it was the only way to fight someone who'd weaponized the system itself. The scope of Tom's operation became clear through Catherine's investigation. 47 families across 3 states, all following the same pattern: single mothers, disabled children, financial vulnerability, isolation. Tom and his mentor had refined their approach over years, creating a sustainable system of exploitation disguised as advocacy. Tom's recruitment of other advocates followed a specific profile: young professionals with idealism but financial struggles. He'd offer legitimate training, real opportunities to help families, and gradually introduce his methods as standard practice. By the time they realized what they were part of, they were complicit and financially dependent on the network. Casey's evidence included recordings from his AAC device that he'd hidden in cloud storage, hours of Tom's phone conversations, discussing strategies for managing difficult families and maximizing benefit extraction. Casey had learned to trigger recordings when he recognized key phrases, building an archive of incriminating conversations. The moment Tom realized Casey's capabilities was captured on facility security footage. Casey had deliberately revealed his fingerspelling during one of Tom's visits, watching his reaction. Tom's mask slipped for just seconds, pure calculation as he reassessed the threat Casey proposed. From that moment, Casey's medication increased dramatically. I infiltrated one of Tom's support groups using a fake identity. The meeting was a recruitment session disguised as peer support. Tom identified vulnerable families, assigned advocates to build relationships, and created dependencies that could be exploited later. Everyone thought they were helping while being drawn into his web. Catherine revealed that federal investigators were building a case, but they needed a family willing to provide complete documentation. The risk was enormous. Tom's network had resources for retaliation, but Casey's evidence, combined with our family's documented experience, could expose the entire operation. The decision wasn't mine alone. I needed Mom to understand what we were facing, to see past Tom's manipulation. But years of exhaustion, grief over Dad, and Tom's psychological influence had worn her down. She wanted peace, even if it meant sacrificing truth. Casey made the choice for us. During a brief moment of clarity between medications, he managed to communicate his decision. He'd sacrificed himself to gather evidence, endured months of suffering to document Tom's methods. He wanted his sacrifice to mean something, to protect other families from experiencing our nightmare. Tom's confidence grew as he believed he'd won. He spoke more freely, revealed more about his network's operations, and even offered again to recruit me. He saw my apparent defeat as an opportunity to gain a valuable asset. His arrogance would be his downfall. The facility announced Casey's improvement and recommended transition to a permanent care home. Tom had already selected the location, a place where his network had complete control, where families had no access, where Casey would disappear into the system forever. We had days to act. Catherine connected us with other families ready to speak out. The Rodriguezes, the Kims, and 12 others who'd lost children to Tom's network. Together, we had enough evidence to expose the pattern, to show how the system had been corrupted to prey on vulnerable families. But Tom had one more card to play. He revealed he'd been recording Mom's confessions about Dad, about her struggles with Casey, about her doubts and fears. He had hours of material that, properly edited, would destroy any credibility we had. The choice was simple: accept Casey's placement or face complete destruction. Mom finally saw Tom clearly. The man who'd promised to help our family had systematically destroyed it for profit. Her protective instincts, dormant under months of manipulation, roared back to life. She told Tom she'd rather face destruction than let him win. Tom's response was swift and brutal. Within hours, Mom's nursing license was under review. Our home faced foreclosure for missed payments we didn't know existed. Extended family received calls about our dangerous situation. He activated every resource in his network to crush us completely. But Casey had prepared for this too. His documentation included contingency plans, evidence caches with trusted individuals, and automated systems that would release information if we were silenced. My brother had thought 10 steps ahead, anticipating Tom's retaliation and preparing countermeasures. The federal investigation accelerated as more families came forward. Tom's network began fracturing as members realized their legal exposure. Some tried to claim ignorance, others attempted to destroy evidence, but Casey's comprehensive documentation made denial impossible. Tom made his final mistake by underestimating our bond as a family. He'd successfully isolated us from external support, but he couldn't break the connection between Casey and me. 8 years of communication, understanding, and trust couldn't be erased by his manipulation. As the investigation closed in, Tom attempted to flee, but Casey had anticipated this too, documenting travel plans and escape routes Tom had mentioned in unguarded moments. Federal agents intercepted him at a small airport, carrying falsified documents and cash from dozens of exploited families. The facility released Casey pending investigation, but the damage was extensive. Months of over-medication, restraint, and isolation had taken their toll. But as I drove him home, I saw his fingers moving in familiar patterns. He was still there, still fighting, still my brother. The network's collapse happened quickly. Without Tom's coordination, the system of referrals and protection crumbled. Facilities faced audits, professionals lost licenses, and families began recovering their children. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was a start. Casey's evidence became crucial in federal testimony. Unable to speak verbally, he communicated through his AAC device and fingerspelling, providing detailed accounts of Tom's methods. His testimony was devastating in its clarity and comprehension, destroying any claim that Tom had been helping disabled individuals. Mom struggled with guilt over her role in enabling Tom. She'd been a victim too, but she felt responsible for bringing him into our lives. Therapy helped, especially from counselors who understood how predators like Tom operated, how they selected and groomed entire families. Our family began healing slowly. Casey's recovery was measured in small victories, a return to his communication patterns, a decrease in self-injurious behaviors, moments of the connection we'd always shared. The trauma would last, but we were together. Tom's sentencing brought no satisfaction, only relief. 20 years for fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of vulnerable adults. His network members faced their own charges, but the real victory was in the systemic changes. New oversight for disability advocacy, protection for families, and recognition of how the system could be corrupted. Other families reached out, sharing their stories of survival and recovery. We formed our own network, not of exploitation, but of genuine support and understanding. Casey became a symbol of resistance, proof that disabled individuals weren't passive victims, but could fight back in their own ways. The financial recovery took years. Tom's theft had been systematic and thorough, but the community that had once shunned us began to understand what we'd endured. Support came from unexpected places, former critics who'd realized they'd been manipulated too. Casey never fully recovered his pre-Tom capabilities. The months of chemical restraint and trauma left lasting impacts, but he adapted, as he always had, finding new ways to communicate and connect. His resilience inspired other families facing similar battles. I returned to school, studying disability rights and advocacy, not Tom's corrupted version, but real support for families navigating complex systems. Casey's experience informed every class, every paper, every moment of my education. Years later, at a conference on disability justice, I presented Casey's story. In the audience sat dozens of families who'd survived similar experiences. As I spoke, I saw Casey in the front row, his fingers moving in the patterns we'd developed together. He was adding details, correcting my memory, participating in his own way. The investigation revealed Tom's mentor had run similar operations for decades. The full scope might never be known. Hundreds of families across the country, millions in stolen benefits, countless lives destroyed. But Casey's courage had ended it, had protected future families from the same fate. Mom found peace eventually. She met someone new, carefully, slowly, with full background checks and family involvement. She learned to trust again while maintaining vigilance. Tom had taught us all to be watchful, to question anyone who seemed too perfect, too helpful, too interested in our vulnerability. Casey developed his own advocacy platform, communicating through technology to help other nonverbal individuals. He consulted on cases where communication barriers were being used to silence disabled voices. His expertise, hard-won through trauma, became a tool for justice. The house felt different without Tom's shadow. Casey's belongings returned to their places, his routines re-established, his presence reclaimed. We modified spaces for his changing needs, creating an environment where he could thrive on his terms. Some nights, I still dream about those months of helplessness, watching Tom dismantle our lives while smiling. But I wake to Casey's humming from the next room, his way of self-soothing that Tom had tried to medicate away. The sound reminds me we survived, we fought back, and we won. Tom tried to contact us once from prison, a letter full of psychological manipulation and veiled threats. Casey insisted on reading it, then methodically documented every technique Tom used, adding it to his archive. Even imprisoned, Tom remained a case study in predatory behavior. The disability community transformed after our case. Families learned to recognize Tom's tactics, to question too perfect advocates, to maintain documentation and connections. Casey's methods became standard practice. Always document, always have backups, always prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd accepted Tom's offer to join his network. Would I have become like him, or would I have found a way to destroy it from within? Casey tells me in his way that the question doesn't matter. We chose to fight together, and that made all the difference. Casey's silence about Tom's interest had been calculated from the beginning. While everyone focused on his apparent regression, he'd been methodically documenting every interaction, every manipulation, every piece of evidence that could expose Tom's network. His AAC device contained hours of recordings he'd triggered during Tom's visits, capturing conversations Tom never knew were being preserved. Catherine arrived at our house with federal investigators 3 days after Tom's prison letter. She'd been building her case for months, but Casey's evidence provided the missing pieces. As Casey navigated through his hidden files, the investigators' expressions shifted from skepticism to shock. His recordings included Tom's phone conversations with network coordinators, discussing targeting strategies for vulnerable families. The audio quality was pristine. Casey had positioned his AAC device strategically during Tom's visits, recording discussions about benefit extraction, family isolation techniques, and coordination with corrupt officials. One recording captured Tom explaining to his mentor how to identify families at their breaking point when they'd sign anything for help. Casey's fearful weeks at the facility hadn't been passive suffering. He'd understood that the system needed documentation of abuse impact, so he'd performed his regression while secretly maintaining his capabilities. His fingers moved rapidly across his device, showing timestamps that proved his strategic timing. Every breakdown, every moment of apparent helplessness had been calculated to gather maximum evidence. His sacrifice went deeper than we'd realized. Casey revealed messages he'd composed but never sent, documenting his decision to endure temporary institutionalization to protect other families. His planning showed sophisticated understanding of legal requirements, evidence authentication, and network vulnerabilities. He'd studied Tom's methods and identified exactly what would trigger federal investigation. I watched my brother present his evidence with newfound respect. His communication device displayed charts mapping Tom's network connections, financial flows between facilities, and patterns of family targeting across state lines. He'd cross-referenced benefit amounts with facility billing, identifying systematic overcharging and fraudulent claims totaling millions. The federal investigators requested Casey's original files for authentication. Their digital forensics team would verify the recording's integrity, but Casey had anticipated this too. He'd maintained multiple backups with timestamp verification, making tampering impossible. His meticulous documentation practices exceeded what many professional investigators achieved. Tom's overconfidence stemmed from his belief in his network's legal protection. Casey's recordings captured conversations with family court staff, facility administrators, and state officials who'd been facilitating quick custody transfers. The corruption went deeper than individual favors. It was a coordinated system designed to streamline family separation for profit. Casey's evidence presentation maintained his dignity while revealing the conspiracy's scope. He showed how Tom's network had infiltrated disability services across 3 states, creating a pipeline that funneled vulnerable families into their system. The investigators took notes as Casey demonstrated how seemingly unconnected professionals were actually coordinating through Tom's network. One recording particularly shocked the investigators. Tom discussed with his mentor how they'd refined their methods over 20 years, learning from each family's resistance to create an unbeatable system. They laughed about families who thought they could fight back, never knowing Casey was recording every word through his AAC device. The investigation's scope expanded as Casey revealed more evidence. He documented connections between Tom's network and insurance fraud, Medicare billing schemes, and systematic theft of disability benefits. Federal prosecutors would later call it one of the most comprehensive evidence packages they'd received from a civilian witness. Catherine coordinated with other families as news of the investigation spread. The Rodriguezes came forward with their own documentation. The Kims had preserved emails showing Tom's identical manipulation tactics. The Williams family had recordings of Tom using the same scripts he'd used on us. Casey's evidence gave them courage to speak. The network's collapse accelerated as members tried to distance themselves from prosecution. Facility directors claimed ignorance of Tom's methods. Caseworkers insisted they'd been manipulated too. But Casey's recordings included their knowing participation, their discussions of profit sharing, their strategies for silencing families who questioned the system. Federal agents executed search warrants across 3 states simultaneously. They seized records from facilities, advocacy organizations, and state agencies. Casey's evidence had provided the roadmap, showing exactly where to find corroborating documentation. His strategic planning made their investigation efficient and thorough. Tom's arrest at the airport made local news, though we avoided media attention. Casey had no interest in fame or recognition. He wanted systemic change. His evidence focused on protecting future families, not personal vindication. The investigators respected his wishes, keeping our family's involvement confidential. The investigation revealed Tom's network had victimized 47 families over 5 years. Casey's documentation helped identify each one, providing contact information and evidence patterns. Families who'd lost hope of ever seeing justice suddenly had federal prosecutors taking their cases seriously. Mom's relief was visible as the network crumbled. She'd carried guilt about trusting Tom, but Casey's evidence showed how sophisticated the manipulation had been. His recordings included Tom's discussions of psychological techniques specifically designed to exploit exhausted caregivers. Understanding the deliberate targeting helped Mom forgive herself. Casey's former caseworker, Catherine, became a key witness. She testified about Tom's recruitment attempts, his efforts to corrupt legitimate advocacy services. Her testimony, combined with Casey's evidence, painted a picture of systematic exploitation disguised as professional help. The federal prosecutors built an airtight case. The facility where Casey had been held faced immediate investigation. Casey's documentation of over-medication, unnecessary restraints, and financial fraud triggered state licensing reviews. Within weeks, they lost their certification. Other facilities in Tom's network faced similar scrutiny as investigators followed Casey's evidence trail. Our family's story became a cautionary tale within disability advocacy circles, though we maintained our privacy. Casey developed training materials showing warning signs of predatory advocates. His communication methods became teaching tools, demonstrating how nonverbal individuals could protect themselves through documentation. The financial investigation revealed the network's full scope. Casey's meticulous tracking showed over $3 million stolen through fraudulent billing and benefit theft. Federal prosecutors used his evidence to freeze assets and begin recovery proceedings. Families would eventually receive partial restitution, though the emotional damage remained. Casey's recovery continued slowly. The months of chemical restraint had lasting effects, but he adapted with characteristic resilience. He developed new communication strategies, working around the damage while maintaining his essential self. His determination inspired other survivors who'd been similarly harmed. Tom's mentor was arrested based on Casey's recordings. The investigation revealed he'd been running similar schemes since the 1990s, refining techniques that Tom later perfected. Casey's evidence exposed decades of exploitation, leading to additional charges and investigations in multiple states. The autism advocacy community underwent major reforms. Casey's evidence had shown how easily legitimate services could be corrupted. New oversight measures, verification requirements, and family protection protocols were implemented. His strategic sacrifice led to real systemic change. Mom returned to work with renewed purpose. She became an informal advisor to other nurses, teaching them to recognize predatory behavior targeting vulnerable families. Her experience, combined with Casey's evidence, helped healthcare workers identify and report suspicious advocacy patterns. Our home felt different without Tom's shadow. Casey's belongings returned to their familiar places. His routines, disrupted for months, slowly reestablished. We modified our environment to support his recovery, creating spaces where he felt safe and in control. The federal investigation expanded as more evidence emerged. Casey's initial documentation had opened floodgates, encouraging other witnesses to come forward. Prosecutors built cases against network members across multiple jurisdictions. The conspiracy's full scope took years to unravel. Casey testified before a federal grand jury using his AAC device. His clear, methodical presentation of evidence impressed prosecutors and jury members alike. His testimony, backed by authenticated recordings, led to multiple indictments. He'd achieved what traditional investigators might have missed. Local disability services underwent review and reform. Casey's evidence had shown how Tom's network infiltrated legitimate organizations. New safeguards were implemented to prevent similar exploitation. His documentation became a template for protecting vulnerable families. The Rodriguezes finally got their son back after 2 years of institutionalization. Casey's evidence proved he'd been placed unnecessarily, his benefits stolen while he deteriorated in substandard care. Their reunion was bittersweet. Damage had been done, but healing could begin. Other families shared similar victories. The Parks prevented their son's institutionalization. The Johnsons regained custody of their daughter. Casey's evidence had given them ammunition to fight systems that had seemed invincible. His sacrifice protected dozens of families from Tom's network. Casey developed consulting protocols for families navigating disability services. His methods emphasized documentation, verification, and maintaining evidence trails. He taught families to protect themselves using tools he'd developed through painful experience. His expertise became a shield for others. Tom's sentencing hearing revealed the conspiracy's human cost. Families testified about destroyed lives, stolen benefits, and children who'd suffered in unnecessary institutionalization. Casey's evidence supported every claim, providing the documentation that made their stories undeniable. Tom received 25 years. Network members faced their own prosecutions. Facility directors, corrupt caseworkers, and complicit officials were charged based on Casey's recordings. Some cooperated with prosecutors, revealing additional crimes. The investigation continued expanding as each arrest led to new evidence. Casey's communication skills evolved as he recovered. He developed innovative methods for nonverbal individuals to document potential abuse. His techniques spread through disability communities, empowering those who'd been silenced. His trauma transformed into tools for protection. We established new routines that prioritized Casey's autonomy. He controlled his schedule, his environment, his communication. After months of forced compliance, he needed to rebuild his sense of agency. We supported his choices, even when recovery meant taking things slowly. The financial restitution process began 18 months after Tom's arrest. Casey's documentation made it possible to trace stolen funds and calculate damages. Families received compensation, though no amount could restore what they'd lost. The money helped, but healing required more than financial recovery. Casey's evidence inspired policy changes at state and federal levels. His documentation methods became recommended practice for disability advocacy organizations. Training programs incorporated his techniques for identifying and documenting potential exploitation. His strategic thinking influenced systemic reforms. Mom found peace in unexpected ways. She connected with other mothers who'd survived similar exploitation. They formed support networks based on shared experience rather than professional guidance. Casey's courage had shown them they could trust their own instincts again. Our family bonds strengthened through shared survival. We'd faced systematic destruction and emerged intact. Casey's strategic brilliance had saved us, but our connection had sustained us. We learned to value our interdependence while respecting individual autonomy. The investigation's final report cited Casey's evidence over 200 times. His documentation provided the framework for understanding how predatory networks operated. Prosecutors called his contribution invaluable. He'd achieved more than many professional investigators. Casey continued developing his advocacy platform. He consulted on cases where communication barriers silenced disabled voices. His expertise helped families recognize manipulation patterns and protect themselves. He transformed trauma into purpose, helping others avoid our experience. 3 years later, we attended a conference on disability justice. Casey presented his documentation methods to advocates and families. His fingers moved across his device with confidence, sharing knowledge gained through sacrifice. The audience listened intently, understanding they were learning from a master strategist. The room filled with families who'd survived similar experiences. Some had been directly helped by Casey's evidence. Others had used his methods to protect themselves. His strategic sacrifice had rippled outward, creating waves of protection throughout vulnerable communities. Casey's presentation concluded with practical advice. He demonstrated documentation techniques, evidence preservation methods, and warning sign recognition. His approach was methodical, accessible, and empowering. He'd transformed his suffering into a shield for others. After the presentation, families approached with their own stories. Casey listened through his device, offering guidance and validation. His responses showed deep understanding of their struggles. He'd become what our family had needed, a guide who truly understood. Mom watched from the audience with tears in her eyes. She'd seen Casey at his lowest, medicated into compliance, seemingly broken. Now he commanded respect from hundreds of advocates. His journey from victim to protector demonstrated resilience beyond words. That evening, we returned to our hotel room exhausted but satisfied. Casey's fingers moved in our old communication patterns, adding details about the day. We fell into familiar rhythms, understanding each other without need for explanation. Our bond had survived everything. The federal investigation officially closed after 4 years. 47 families had received justice. Dozens of corrupt professionals faced prosecution. Millions in stolen benefits were recovered. Casey's evidence had dismantled a network that seemed untouchable. His strategic sacrifice achieved its purpose. We returned home to continue our lives. Casey maintained his advocacy work, helping families navigate systems designed to exploit them. His methods spread through disability communities, creating protection networks based on mutual support rather than professional authority. His legacy grew quietly but powerfully. The house felt like home again. Casey's presence filled spaces that Tom had tried to empty. We'd reclaimed our family, our routines, our connections. The trauma remained part of our story, but it no longer defined us. We'd survived, exposed the truth, and protected others. Casey's fingers still move in patterns I recognize, adding layers to conversations others might miss. Our communication, refined through crisis, connects us deeply. We understand each other's silences, read meaning in small gestures. 8 years of caregiving created a language trauma couldn't break. Some nights, Casey reviews his evidence files, ensuring backups remain secure. He knows similar networks still operate. Predators still target vulnerable families. His documentation methods spread through online communities, teaching protection strategies. He guards against future threats while living fully in the present. Our story ends not with dramatic confrontation, but quiet victory.